So one quick example to tie everything that we've talked about so far together before we get into the more complex case. Here I've drawn up a supply and demand curve, and I tell you to find what the consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus are going to be for this particular example. So let's go ahead and use everything that we know so far to go ahead and figure out these three particular measures of welfare. First, we want to go ahead and find consumer surplus. So consumer surplus, we need to go ahead and identify the area for consumer surplus. And if we remember, it's going to be the area above the price but below the demand curve. Here, because we are working in equilibrium once again, we see that it's going to be a very easy task for us because all we need to go ahead and focus in on is going to be the triangle on top. So area above the price, so above the $50, below the demand curve, the only area that matches up with that is going to be this big triangle on top. So sometimes with these examples or these problems, it's good to go ahead and shade in the areas that you do know for sure. So this is going to be our consumer surplus. Because we are working in equilibrium, we automatically know it's going to be a triangle. We have to go ahead and figure out the base and the height in order to figure out the specific value. In this instance, the base is going to be 50 minus 0. So here we start off from the equilibrium point all the way down to our zero quantity or to whatever number it says on the axes, and then our height is going to be 100 minus 50. So half the base times the height. 1/2 times 50 minus 0 times 100 minus 50. And you want to go ahead, plug this into your calculator, simplify it as much as you can. 1/2 times 50 times 50. So 1/2 times 50 times 50 will give us $1,250 worth of consumer surplus. Knowing this, go ahead, find what producer surplus is going to be. Producer surplus, the formal definition of it is the area above the supply curve but below the price. Below the price, above the supply curve, the only area that matches up with that is going to be the bottom triangle that we have right here. So here, we'll make it horizontal stripes, horizontal lines. And this is going to be our producer surplus. So here, you always want to stay cognizant and consistent with your definitions to calculate, to figure out where these areas are, because they will come in handy once we get to the more complex case. Once again, we are dealing with a triangle. So we have a base, we have the height. Anytime we're in equilibrium, the bases are going to be the same. So 50 minus 0, and then the height is going to be 50 minus 10. Here, remember, it's not going to be, it can be symmetric, but in this case, it's not symmetric. So once again, plug in those numbers. 1/2 times 50 minus 0 times 50 minus 10. And then once you go ahead and get a lot of practice with all of this, you can go ahead and skip these long steps right here. You can just say, hey, just take the difference between the numbers right there to find the distance before the base and height. But if you need a little bit more time, just go ahead, put out all the numbers just to make sure that you are getting all the correct numbers. 1/2 times 50 times 40 will give us $1,000 worth of producer surplus. And then finally here, the last thing that we can go ahead and talk about is total surplus. And total surplus is essentially just going to be consumer surplus plus producer surplus, or this entire big triangle that we see right here. There are many different ways to approach it. Here, we'll just go ahead and do the simplified way because we've already figured out what consumer surplus is, what producer surplus is. So when we go ahead, add these two together, consumer surplus and producer surplus, we get total surplus, which is 1,250 plus 1,000. This will give us $2,250. So I'll put this down here, $2,250 worth of total surplus. And remember, this total surplus value that we see right here is going to be at its maximum because we are working at the equilibrium price. There's no other point on our supply and demand curve that will generate this amount of efficiency or welfare. We are being market efficient in this case. So with all this in mind, things are fairly simple as we said before because we are working in equilibrium. But what do you think happens to each one of these measures if prices go above equilibrium? What happens if we were working at a price of $75 instead? Or what happens if prices go below equilibrium, say at a price of $20? What do you think is going to happen to consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus? We can calculate out specific values for each one of these as well, and that's going to change our illustration just a little bit. So we'll go ahead and tackle that case in the next lecture.